It's 10 October 2025. It's a Friday. We're back in Christopher Caldwell's wonderful book, Age of Entitlement, Chapter 2 on race and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, how to properly understand that. It's going to be from a Republican perspective, which fits with our programming here on The Republican Professor. We always have spiritual reflection before we start. Well, not always, but just since the last month or so, last a little bit more than a month, been trying this out. You can feel free to fast forward through that if you want, but we do a spiritual reflection first. Um, we're in Psalm 27. By the way, welcome to the Republican Professor. I'm your host, Dr. Lucas J. Mather. We're doing Psalm 27 today and Streams in the Desert, January 11th. Psalm 27. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? This is the King James Version. The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? When the wicked, even mine enemies and foes, came upon me to eat upon my flesh, they stumbled and fell. Though an host should encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war should arise against me, in this will I be confident. One thing have I desired of the Lord, that will I seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord, and to inquire in his temple. For in the time of trouble he shall hide me in his pavilion, in the secret of his tabernacle shall he hide me. He shall set up me upon the rock. And now shall mine head be lifted up above mine enemies round about me. Therefore will I offer in his tabernacle sacrifices of joy. I will sing, yea, I will sing praises unto the Lord. Hear, O Lord, when I cry with my voice. Have mercy also upon me, and answer me. When thou saidst, seek ye my face, my heart said unto thee, thy face, Lord, will I seek. Hide not my face far from me. Put not thy servant away in anger. Thou hast been my help. Leave me not, neither forsake me, O God of my salvation. When my father and my mother forsake me, then the Lord will take me up. Teach me thy path. Teach me thy way, O Lord, and lead me in the plain path because of mine enemies. Deliver me not over unto the will of mine enemies, for false witnesses are risen up against me, and such as breathe out cruelty. Verse 13, Psalm 27. I had fainted unless I believed to see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait on the Lord, be of good courage, and he shall strengthen thine heart. Wait, I say, on the Lord. Psalm 27, King James Version. A moment of reflection. Streams in the Desert is next, January 11th, page 12. Comfort ye, comfort ye my people, saith your God. Isaiah 40, verse 1. Store up comfort. This was the prophet's mission. The world is full of comfortless hearts, and ere thou art sufficient for this lofty ministry, thou must be trained. And thy training is costly in the extreme. For to render it perfect, thou too must pass through the same afflictions as are wringing countless hearts of tears and blood. Thus thy own life becomes the hospital ward where thou art taught the divine art of comfort. Thou art wounded, that in the binding up of thy wounds by the great physician, thou mayest learn how to render first aid to the wounded everywhere. Dost thou wonder why thou art passing through some special sorrow? Wait till 10 years are past, and thou wilt find many others afflicted as thou art. Thou wilt tell them how thou hast suffered and hast been comforted. Then, as the tale is unfolded, and the anodynes applied, which once thy God wrapped around thee, in the eager look and the gleam of hope, that shall chase the shadow of despair across the soul, thou shalt know why thou wast afflicted, and bless God for the discipline that stored thy life with such a fund of experience and helpfulness. God does not comfort us to make us comfortable, but to make us comforters. That's a good line. I'm going to read that again. God does not comfort us to make us comfortable, but to make us comforters. They tell me I must bruise the rose's leaf, ere I can keep and use its fragrance brief. They tell me I must break the skylark's heart, ere her caged song will make the silence start. They tell me love must bleed and friendship weep, ere in my deepest need I touch that deep. Must it be always so with precious things? Must they be bruised and go with beaten wings? Ah, yes, by crushing days, by caging nights, by scar of thorn and stony ways, these blessings are. A moment of reflection. Streams in the Desert, January 11th. Okay, let's get to work. We're in the age of entitlement again. The last time we were in this was the day after Charlie Kirk was murdered by Democrats. And this is written by Christopher Caldwell. I'd like to thank Christopher Caldwell for making this material available, for writing it. It's published by Simon & Schuster. We'd like to thank Simon & Schuster for publishing it, making it available. Throw some money Simon & Schuster's way. Reward them for creating such a wonderful product for us to benefit from which to benefit. I know that I'm incredibly grateful for this book and for the work that goes into wonderful books. Support your local book dealer. Let's not just make places like Amazon rich. Of course, local book dealers aren't really getting rich. You know what I mean? You know what I mean, Vern? Race, Chapter 2. The Civil Rights Act, freedom of association. What did whites think they were getting? What did blacks think they were getting? Not civil rights, but human rights, origins of affirmative action and political correctness. These are the subheadings of Chapter 2 in Chris Caldwell's Age of Entitlement, America since the 60s. It's a very insightful political phenomenology of American politics since the 60s. We're going to do a fair use and transformative reading of this material for nonprofit educational purposes only. So let's get into that fair use and transformative reading. The very first days of the 1960s saw the publication of a scholarly landmark. In January 1960, Harvard University's Belknap Press brought out a new edition of The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, 1845, edited by the historian Benjamin Quarles, a professor at Morgan State University in Maryland. This is the first paragraph of Chris Caldwell's Ch.2, The Age of Entitlement. Today, with the figure of Douglass towering over American culture in high school, or as Rush Limbaugh used to say, high screwl, curricula and museum exhibits, on postage stamps and television specials, we might assume that what made the publication important was Quarles' new interpretation of a classic American autobiography. We would be wrong. We would be wrong. Far from being thought a classic in 1960, Douglass's earliest memoir, covering his years as a slave, had been out of print for more than a century and almost unmentioned in print since the Civil War. Holy crap. Caldwell is bringing the fire, buddy. He's bringing the fire. Nice job, Chris. What else do you have to say? Let's keep going. Wow. Douglass's career as an abolitionist orator, newspaper publisher, and diplomat was important to historians of the 19th century, but, and there's only one T, so don't get too excited, his struggles as a slave were not of obvious relevance to mid-20th century Americans. That's very interesting. Today, slavery is at the center of Americans' official history, with race as the central concept in the country's official self-understanding. When he says today, what does he mean by today? Well, go back to the copyright. When was this published? Well, it's 2020. Simon and Schuster, New York. What else happened in 2020? You might have been too busy with other things to notice this, but I think 2020 was a situation where some people were extra busy and other people had nothing else to do but read, but they didn't read. They did other things. Okay, well, never before the 1960s was this the case. For almost all of American history, racial conflict was understood as a set of episodes, some shameful, some glorious, set against a larger story about building a constitutional republic. After the 1960s, the constitutional republic was sometimes discussed as if it were a mere set of tools for resolving larger conflicts about race and human rights. We're on page 8 at the top. This next section is called the Civil Rights Act. Incredibly timely. I mean, I was going to do this. You can check it for yourself. Check it before you wreck it. This was on the schedule before Charlie was murdered. Charlie talked about this, and I think I've mentioned that before. That's not the only reason it's relevant. It's relevant for the reasons why Charlie talked about it. It's because people are revisiting this stuff. We're talking about Bostock versus Clayton County. That's all about the 1964 Civil Rights Act as it pertains to sex. This chapter is called Race. Let's get into this next section, the Civil Rights Act. If the 1960s were a revolutionary time, the core of the revolution was race. Black people. These are his words, okay? Black people in southern states, with a few reform-minded white allies across the country. And again, these are his terms. I don't use terms like black and white without saying so-called. Why? Because I've never seen a black person before. I've seen a black crayon. Like, you ever see those crayons? Crayola crayons? They have white in there too. I've never seen any human being with those colors. That's me. I mean, if you want to redefine these terms to something else, fine. You do you. Black people in southern states with a few reform-minded white allies across the country were challenging and demonstrating and marching against various local systems built up in the century since the Civil War to keep black people apart from white people. The whites who had erected and enforced these systems used them to claim the best fruits of the local economy. That's not badly said. That's pretty well articulated. World War II had knit the country together, exposing Southerners to the variety of European-descended ethnicities now present in the Northeast and Midwest, and introducing Americans to the problems of other regions, but not directly to the problems of other races, for the armed forces would not be integrated until 1948. In the 1950s, highways, televisions, corporate expansions made it hard to hide any part of the country from any other part. Systems of racial separation, known collectively as Jim Crow, lost much of their logic and, with it, their power to enforce, intimidate, and control. By the way, get a physical copy of this book. Get a physical copy of this book. It's such a pleasure to read a physical book. Support physical books. Support publishers that are creating these kinds of wonderful treasures for your bookshelf. And support local book dealers. Back to Caldwell. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, passed by Lyndon Johnson, I would say signed by Lyndon Johnson, but okay, in the immediate aftermath of John F. Kennedy's death, was meant to deliver the coup de grace to Jim Crow and to end the black marches and police crackdowns in Mississippi and Alabama that television viewers were seeing almost weekly. The act banned. Yeah, what did the act ban? Tell us about the act. The act banned racial discrimination in voting booths, Title I, hotels, restaurants, and theaters, Title II, public facilities from libraries to swimming pools to bathrooms, Title III, and public schools, Title IV. But that was not all it did. It also empowered the federal government to reform and abolish certain institutions that stood in the way of racial equality and to establish new ones. By expanding the Federal Civil Rights Commission, Title V, by subjecting to bureaucratic scrutiny any company or institution that received government money, Title VI, by laying out hiring practices for all companies with more than 15 employees, by creating a new presidential agency, the Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC, with the power to file lawsuits, conduct investigations, and order redress. By doing all these things, the act emboldened and incentivized bureaucrats, lawyers, intellectuals, political agitators to become the eyes and ears and even the foot soldiers of civil rights enforcement. This is page 9. You getting this? Over time, more of the country's institutions were brought under the act's scrutiny. Funny how that works. Funny how that works. Eventually, all of them were. Damn. 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 The grounds for not finding someone or something guilty of discrimination expanded. New civil rights acts, notably the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Fair Housing Act 1968, brought new rights for Black citizens and new bureaucracies to enforce them. So the growth of government, you see this, right? The growth of government. What could go wrong? Well, if you like the growth of government, I don't see what you would complain about. I don't know how you complain about fascism and the growth and like the growth of government all at the same time, but that's just me, I guess. Maybe it's just me. I don't know. Maybe it's me. Not to bring up health food, but let us continue. Civil rights transformed the country, not just constitutionally, but also culturally and demographically. In ways few people anticipated, it proved to be the mightiest instrument of domestic enforcement the country had ever seen. It can be fairly described as the largest undertaking of any kind in American history. Wow. Costing trillions upon trillions of dollars and spanning half century. It rivals, in terms of energy invested, the peopling of the West, the building of transcontinental railways and highways, the maintenance of Pax Americana for half a century after World War II, or, for that matter, any of the wars the country has fought, foreign or civil. Page 9 at the bottom. On top of those conflicts, the United States has had two massive domestic policy programs that mobilized public resources and sentiments so thoroughly that they were presented to the public as what the philosopher and psychologist William James called a moral equivalent of war. The war on poverty in the 1960s and the war on drugs in the 1980s and 90s. Both were mere battlefronts in a larger struggle over race relations. Page 10 at the top. I had to change the page. The reinterpretation of America's entire history and purpose in light of its race problem is the main ideological legacy of the last 50 years. Wow. The scholar Derek Bell described the quarter century after the Supreme Court's desegregation decision in Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, 1954, as the greatest racial consciousness raising the country has ever known. This consciousness raising has only intensified since. Race is the part of the human experience in which American school children are most painstakingly instructed. Their studies of literature, of war, of civics are all subordinated to it. Race was invested with a religious significance. It became an ethical absolute. One could even say that the civil rights movement, inside and outside the government, became a doctrinal institution, analogous to established churches in pre-democratic Europe. And yet, there was something new, something mid-20th century about the way the US government sought to mold the whole of society, down to the most intimate private acts around the ideology of anti-racism, around the ideology of anti-racism. You could see this ideology emerging in a way Quarles reimagined the young Frederick Douglass. Here's a quote from that guy Quarles, whoever Quarles was. Naturally, the narrative, talking about Frederick Douglass, does not bother to take up the difficulties inherent in abolishing slavery. These Douglass would have dismissed with a wave of a hand. Similarly, the narrative recognizes no claim other than that of the slave. To Douglass, the problems of social adjustments, if the slaves were freed, were nothing. The property rights of the masters were nothing. States' rights were nothing. He simply refused to discuss these matters. As he viewed it, his function was to shake people out of their lethargy and goad them into action, not to discover reasons for sitting on the fence, unquote. That whole thing was a quote from the word naturally to the fence. That was a quote from Quarles. Okay, here's back to Caldwell, page 10 at the bottom. It is true that in the years before the Civil War, not only the young Douglass, but also the New England abolitionists in whose orbit moved sometimes spoke in such an absolutist way. Well, I got to redo that sentence. I'm sorry. It is true that in the years before the Civil War, not only the young Douglass, but also the New England abolitionists in whose orbit he moved sometimes spoke in such an absolutist way. By the way, they were Republicans, FYI. But when Quarles wrote in 1960, such a stance was still out of favor, page 11 at the top. As most historians till then had understood it, the absolutism of Douglass and others had hurried the country into a bloody civil war and unnecessarily complicated the Reconstruction that followed. In fact, the constitutional and social obstacles to abolishing slavery had been formidable. Amen, brother. Making attempts to shake people out of their lethargy and goad them into action correspondingly dangerous. Yep, that's right. That is exactly right. When Rutherford B. Hayes, on taking the presidency in 1877, he's a Republican, ended the military occupation of the South, and with it, efforts to reform race relations there, it was not because he was a coward or reactionary. Amen. He is nailing this. He's totally nailing it. Listen up. Barely a decade after a civil war had cost 600,000 lives, the entire country, even the North, had turned against Reconstruction. The cost of solving the American race problem had risen beyond what voters were willing to pay. Yeah. Republicans lost steam because the Democrats were so powerful still. It's hard to know what were we supposed to commit genocide against the Democrats? Is that what the answer was back then? Um, That's not what Lincoln would have done. It's certainly not what his successor, a Democrat who looked the other way when the Klan was forming in his own state, would have done. See the episode I did on Lincoln's second inaugural address, biblical themes in it, for President's Day last February 2025. So, when the historian C. Van Woodward described the 20th century civil rights movement as a second Reconstruction, he meant it partly as a warning that later historians and polemicists have been deaf to. Like the young Douglas, they dismissed, with a wave of the hand, the notion that there might be costs to keeping intolerance at bay. Until the election of 2016, the second Reconstruction appeared to have fared better than the first. A half century on, its institutions were still standing. Well, I'm going to add something there. And he might be too nice to say this, but this is the Republican professor. And it's not that I'm being mean, I'm just being accurate. And some people take it as the accuracy is not being nice. But the Republicans shaped the Democrats. The Democrats changed. It took a long time, and it took enormous effort and cost. But the Democrats finally changed. It took a long time of Republican leadership. And so when Democrats change, they want to get all the credit. No, no. Republicans were the ones leading the way at great cost. It's great that you changed, but you're a little late. Like when I say a little, I mean a lot late. You're a lot late. But I'm glad you did. In fact, I think I have the title for this episode. It's Republicans and Race, or Racial Discrimination and Republicans, something like that. I don't know. I'll play around with it. What was This is on page 11, the bottom there. What was innovative about the reformers of the 1960s was neither their morality nor their perspicacity. Few Americans could contemplate segregation without feelings of hypocrisy, scandal, and shame. It had always been understood, even by many of its Southern defenders, you know, that government-sponsored racial inequality was a contradiction of America's constitutional principles and an affront to its Christian ones. Those who stood up to segregation in the middle of the 20th century did not have any special insight into this, nor were they braver or more humane than, say, Homer Plessy had been when he boarded a whites only train car in Louisiana in 1895 to challenge the state's recently enacted segregation laws. What made the modern framers of civil rights different from the changing the page, I'm also changing sides, the 19th century ones, was their conception of power and their genius for wielding it. They succeeded where their forebears had failed because they were confident in resorting to coercion, indifferent to imposing financial burdens on future generations, and willing to put existing constitutional freedoms at risk in order to secure new ones. Why wouldn't they have been? Page 12 at the top. They were the heirs to a civilization that had just vanquished totalitarianism on 2 continents and come to produce a quarter of the world's GDP, and was now sending rockets out to explore space. The folkways of the South clashed intolerably with mid-century Americans' self-image. Americans were civilized, modern, gentlemanly. Segregation was sleazy, medieval, and underhanded. Fulton County, Georgia, kept black people from voting by requiring them to complete a 30-item questionnaire demanding that they lay out the legal bureaucratic procedure for changing the seat of a county, name the state comptroller and all of the state's federal district court judges, and state how many votes Georgia had in the federal electoral college. The smugness and cruelty of the system, the way it appeared to taunt, demean, demoralize its victims, even as it threatened and bullied them, was infuriating, and not only to blacks. A key quote in that last paragraph, I think, and this is just my correct opinion, when he says the folkways of the South clashed intolerably with mid-century's self-image. Yeah. Okay. The reaction when it came was pitiless. The Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts provided permanent emergency powers to smash the sham democracy of the segregated South. And he's being nice. They were Democrats. They were Democrats in the South. They mixed surveillance by volunteers, litigation by lawyers, and enforcement by bureaucrats. This was a new model of federal government with a transformative power that was immediately apparent. Thoroughgoing and versatile, it often able to bypass the separation of powers. That's kind of a problem right there. The separation of powers is meant to protect individual liberty, is it not? That would indicate there's going to be problems. Civil rights law became the template for much of American policy making after the 1960s, including on matters far removed from race. This was mostly on grounds of its efficiency, but that efficiency rested on certain assertions about values. To set oneself against civil rights was to set oneself against the whole moral thrust of American government. This is interesting. You like how he's setting this up? All right. I like it too. I like it too. We're in the next section called Freedom of Association, top of page 13. The United States is today a free country in a very different sense than it was between the administrations of George Washington and John F. Kennedy. This is what people don't understand. A lot of people. I mean, I understand it. Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, 1954, the unanimous Supreme Court decision, written by a Republican, by the way, that ordered the desegregation of all the country's schools. By the way, that it was written by the vice presidential candidate for the Republican Party, 1948, FYI, was not just a landmark decision, but an unusual one. It was brief to the point of curtness, shorn of footnotes and case references. Each of its 2 parts ran about the length of a newspaper column. It was less a judicial argument than a judicial order. That is correct. See Jurisprudence by Edmund Kahn. I think it's New York University Law Review, 1955. The justices ignored the subject to which they had devoted most of their deliberations, whether the 14th Amendment, drafted in the wake of the Civil War to guarantee equal protection of the laws, had intended to permit segregated schools. Instead, they asked whether the doctrine of separate but equal, used to justify school segregation, was possible in practice. It may surprise readers of a later generation to discover that the justices believed it was possible, not just in cherry picked cases when taken from model schools, but in the actual schools that the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, isn't everybody colored, had chosen to argue over. The justices noted findings that the Negro, and this is the original language here, and white schools involved have been equalized or are being equalized with respect to buildings, curricula, qualifications, and salaries of teachers, and other tangible factors. They nonetheless repudiated the separate but equal doctrine for primary schools on the grounds that, because of intangible considerations and qualities which are incapable of objective measurement, these are direct quotes, segregation is usually interpreted as denoting the inferiority of the Negro group. Again, direct quotes, original language. Even many ardent opponents of segregation were troubled by Brown's project to rewrite the Constitution on the authority of vague pronouncements about the way things are usually interpreted. Bottom page 13, about to change the page to 14. Thank you for your patience. In an article published at the end of 1959, Harvard Law School professor Herbert Weschler described Brown as an opinion which is often read with less fidelity by those who praise it than by those who by whom it is condemned. That's very interesting. That's a good quote. The most circumlocutory way. I'm having a hard time with that word for some reason today. Circumlocutory way imaginable of saying that it was wrongly decided. That's a good quote. Yeah. I totally botched it, but yeah. Herbert Weschler described Brown as an opinion which is often read with less fidelity by those who praise it than by those by whom it is condemned. That's insightful. That's very insightful. And I think it's probably true, having studied the matter carefully myself. Weschler showed in devastating detail that Brown would have been impossible under any faithful reading of what the drafters of the 14th Amendment had meant by equality. Yeah. He also argued that the Brown justices had blundered when they focused on equality in the first place. The heart of the matter with segregation was not equality, but the conflicts it created with the implicit First Amendment rights of freedom of association. These conflicts were not easily solved, Weschler showed. If the freedom of association is denied by segregation, integration forces an association upon those for whom it is unpleasant or repugnant. This is very insightful. Very insightful. Yeah, this is the really key issue here. Given a situation where the state must practically choose between denying the association to those individuals who wish it or imposing it on those who would avoid it, keep bathrooms in mind, locker rooms in mind when we're talking about this. Is there a basis in neutral principles for holding that the Constitution demands that the claims for association should prevail? Weschler hoped, well, that was a quotation from Weschler, sorry. If the freedom of association, quote, if the freedom of association is denied by segregation, this is a block quote by Weschler, Harvard law professor, 1959. If the, quote, if the freedom of association is denied by segregation, integration forces an association upon those for whom it is unpleasant or repugnant. Given a situation where the state must practically choose between denying the association to those individuals who wish it or imposing it on those who would avoid it, is there a basis in neutral principles for holding that the Constitution demands that the claims for association should prevail? Weschler hoped to find such a basis, but in constitutional terms, the decision was arbitrary and open-ended. Now, at this point, I think I want to point out something here. Okay. I've already said that Brown was written by a Republican, right? I've already said that. The vice presidential candidate of the Republican Party. I mean, he was governor of California, Republican governor, Earl Warren. You know that, right? I'm pointing that out because if we bring criticism to bear, it's Republicans criticizing Republicans. And the criticism is mangling the constitutional argument. It's no doubt that the Brown versus Board was a judicial order, but judges are supposed to justify their, quote, opinions, unquote. And their opinions have as much persuasive weight as the justification is normative and fits with the epistemic norms appropriate for justifying your conclusion. And that's what Caldwell's pointing out. And Caldwell's quoting Weschler, and Weschler's being honest about it in 1959. They're not mentioning Democrat versus Republican here. There was an attempt to have a concurrence. And I mean, it's been a while since I've looked into this, but I believe it was Robert Jackson that was writing that concurrence, and he was in the hospital. And I think he just gave up, man. I think he gave up. But apparently that concurrence, there's a draft of it floating around out there, and it's better. And I'm a Republican saying that, and guess what? Bob Jackson was a Democrat. So I'm giving him credit. You can't accuse me of only praising only praising Republicans and never praising Democrats. You can't accuse me of that. It's sad that I have to point this stuff out. This is basic stuff, though. This is really basic stuff. In constitutional terms, Caldwell continues on the bottom of page 14, the decision was arbitrary and open-ended. Brown granted the government the authority to put certain public bodies under surveillance for racism. Since the damage it aimed to mend consisted of intangible considerations, that's an inherent problem right there. There was no obvious limit to this surveillance. And once the Civil Rights Act introduced into the private sector this assumption that all separation was prima facie evidence of inequality. By the way, we have separate but equal bathrooms and locker rooms. See, keep this in mind. You see how this generated a problem. It took a while, but it did. Humans are not exactly the brightest tools in the shed all the time. Sometimes it takes a while, but it did. Desegregation implied a revocation of the old freedom of association altogether. Just as assuming that two parallel lines can meet overturns much of Euclidean geometry, eliminating freedom of association from the U.S. Constitution changed everything. The only thing I would point out here is I would say I don't think I would put it that way. Nothing was eliminated from the Constitution. Judicial actors misinterpreted and misapplied and didn't argue correctly. And the problems with the argument, not necessarily the conclusion, but the problems with the argument and getting to that conclusion was what the problem was. It wasn't the Constitution was changed. But Chris is doing a great job, so let's keep going. Within a decade of Brown, the philosopher Leo Strauss was warning that attempts to root out discrimination could backfire badly. In an off-the-cuff remark about Jewishness and identity that he gave to the Hillel Foundation at the University of Chicago, I'm on top of page 15, he spoke about the difficulties under which minorities, and specifically Jews, labored, but he warned about the dangers of doing too much to change them. Quote, a liberal society stands or falls by the distinction between the political or the state and the society, or by the distinction between the public and the private. In the liberal society, where there is necessarily a private sphere with which the state's legislation must not interfere, liberal society necessarily makes possible, permits, and even fosters what is called by many discrimination, unquote. Here's back to Caldwell. Tempting though it might be to attack this discrimination at its root, the cure would wind up worse than the disease. Okay, that's exactly why Barry Goldwater in 1964 voted against it in the Senate. And he had a black chief of staff. He desegregated the Arizona National Guard. He had a Jewish last name. He's not on the Klan's Christmas list. He's hardly a WASP, okay? This is all basic stuff. You know this stuff, right? Tell me you know it. Well, if you don't, you're in the right place. Yeah, the cure would be worse than disease, Strauss warned. The prohibition against every discrimination would mean the abolition of the private sphere, the denial of the difference between the state and society, in a word, the destruction of liberal society. He's using the term liberal in a different sense than we mean by Democrat, FYI. From the start, it took courage to dissent from the intellectual consensus in favor of Brown. The University of Chicago First Amendment scholar Harry Calvin Jr. tried to disguise his own misgivings as praise. Page 15 at the bottom, quote, one of the most distinctive features of the Negro Revolution, this is original language, has been its almost military assault on the Constitution via the strategy of systematic litigation. Here there has been no waiting for the random and mysterious process by which controversies are finally brought to the Supreme Court. There has been rather a marshaling of cases, a timing of litigation, a forced feeding of legal growth. This has been a brilliant use of democratic legal process, and its success has been deservedly spectacular. I'm old-fashioned enough to read the development not as political pressure on the court, which then, as a political institution, responded, but rather as a strategy to trap democracy in its own decencies. Wow. Unquote. Turning the page, page 16. In his own esoteric way, Calvert invites us to view the civil rights revolution as a potential constitutional catastrophe. In what healthy society is an almost military assault on the Constitution worthy of praise? What upstanding political actor takes advantage of another's decencies to entrap him? And when court cases do not arise naturally out of a country's ordinary social frictions, but are confected by interested parties, doesn't the entire tradition of judicial review lose its legitimacy? Especially since in a country where lawyers must go through an expensive training and guild-like selection, those interested parties are likely to be the country's elites. Calvert implicitly accepts lock, stock, and barrel, an argument that back then was usually put forward by Southerners, that much civil rights litigation amounted to barratry, a gaming of the justice system through a creation of stylized cases. Such scruples were clearly on the way out. Today, the staging of court cases is such a standard strategy for activist litigators that even many lawyers are unaware that until the 1950s, it was widely considered a straightforward species of judicial corruption, and not just in the South. Incidentally, I would say a good oblique take on this topic right here is Mary Ann Glendon's A Nation Under Lawyers. Mary Ann Glendon's A Nation Under Lawyers. She teaches at Harvard Law School, which I think is a community college in New Hampshire or something like that. It's up there. It might even be in Canada. I don't even know, but it's up there, north. Might be in Nova Scotia or Newfoundland. It's probably in Newfoundland. The Yale Law Journal, Chris Caldwell continues, nothing against Mary Ann Glendon. She's great. I talked to her briefly on an email. Yeah, it's a great book, A Nation Under Lawyers. The Yale Law Journal had already leveled a similar accusation that the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People had been allowed to take up a role in the various civil rights cases as private attorney general. The NAACP not only staged events, it scripted them. The plaintiffs it handpicked to carry them out were chosen for their sympathy and skill. One example is Rosa Parks. Over decades, Black History Month has taught millions of school children to think of her as a tired seamstress whose need to rest her weary legs in the white section of the Montgomery, Alabama city bus unleashed a storm of spontaneous protest. But she was considerably more than that. 5 months before the Montgomery bus boycott began, she attended the Highlander Folk School in Newmarket, Tennessee, an academy that the Congress of Industrial Organizations had set up for training social agitators. She was an organizer of considerable sophistication, one of the intellectual leaders of the Montgomery NAACP chapter. Americans have in recent years been fond of boasting that unlike most nations, page 17 at the top here, where it is heritage, history, and race that binds people together, the United States is a place where that one can belong to regardless of background. That is true enough, but there is a reason most countries are not multi-ethnic countries, and why most of those that have tried to become multi-ethnic countries have failed. Where a shared heritage is absent or unrecognized, it is the contemporary United States. All the eggs of national cohesion are placed in the basket of the Constitution, hence a paradox. Where a shared heritage is absent or unrecognized, as it is in the contemporary United States, all the eggs of national cohesion are placed in the basket of the Constitution, hence a paradox. With the dawn of the civil rights era, let me just say something about the language of the civil rights era. Okay. It's a little bit misleading. It's one of the few complaints I have about this book, but it's common language, so he's not using any language that's not common. The civil rights, eh, you guys, the first Civil Rights Act was 1866. Republicans. It's not the 50s and 60s. And Republicans are springboarding on the Constitution itself a civil rights revolution. The civil rights movement goes way back, way back. So it's misleading to say that we went all this. I mean, a lot of school children think that the United States was just oblivious and even hostile to this tradition instead of being the tradition, which is the correct answer. It just was the civil rights movement. It's America. Some people would go back to Magna Carta. Oh, fine. Go back to, you could go back to the Ten Commandments as far as I can tell. It's kind of nice to have codified in law a right not to be murdered. Wouldn't you agree? And I mean, maybe we could have started there with the Klan, in opposing the Klan and slavery. The right not to be murdered. The right to not have your stuff stolen from you. Hello. And if you want a more obvious targeting of the American slavery experiment, celebrated and put forward by Democrats for decades before the Republican Party was able to stop it, I would say that just go back to Exodus 21, which makes it a capital offense. That's the death penalty for kidnapping somebody. Which is what American slavery was predicated on. You know, I mean, a great case to read the Amistad schooner case in 1841. Just read Joseph Story's handling of that case. Yes, it's right before 1842 Prigg versus Pennsylvania, which was not our finest hour, but there's a lot there in the Amistad schooner case. The reason that those slaves were freed was because there was evidence that they had been kidnapped. The crime against kidnapping. Okay. Right. Okay. I'm hoping that this helps. Maybe it doesn't. My guess is if you're paying attention, it does. Just keep paying attention here. You're going to learn something. All right. I'll always go back to the Bible where I can because I think the Bible supplies a lot of the, quote, civil rights movement properly understood. Maybe you disagree with me. Okay, fine. We can have a discussion. That's fine. Yeah. Where a shared heritage is absent or unrecognized, as it is in the contemporary United States, all the eggs of national cohesion are placed in the basket of the Constitution. Hence a paradox. With the dawn of the civil rights era, I don't like that case, but okay. I don't like the way of describing it. The U.S. Constitution, the very thing that made it possible for an ethnically varied nation to live together, came under stress. The problem is that rights cannot simply be added to a social contract without changing it. To establish new liberties is to extinguish others. This difficulty would be at the root of the earliest debates over civil rights legislation. In the summer of 1963, well before Kennedy's assassination, one anecdote from the Senate's debates captured the imagination of the public. Senators skeptical of the civil rights legislation hinted that Mrs. Murphy, a hypothetical old widow who rented out a room in her house in a northern city, might end up bearing the brunt of federal surveillance and law enforcement if she got too picky about whom she accepted as a tenant. The legislation's backers created the question as ridiculous. Of course, a boarding house, unlike hotels that would be covered in any civil rights legislation, was Mrs. Murphy's personal property with which she could do as she pleased. But the distinction was not as obvious as pro-civil rights legislators claimed. And the certitudes that rested on it proved complacent. In his opening remarks at the 1964 March on Washington, A. Philip Randolph, organizer of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and of the march itself, warned that real freedom will require many changes. Page 18 at the top, in the nation's political and social philosophies and institutions. For one thing, we must destroy the notion that Mrs. Murphy's property rights include the right to humiliate me because of the color of my skin. The sanctity of private property takes second place to the sanctity of human personality, unquote. So it was after the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Property simply would not enjoy the same constitutional protection that it had before. Neither would the traditional understanding of freedom of association. Florida's segregationist governor, C. Ferris Bryant, was able to describe this understanding as something all Americans shared. Let me guess, he was a Democrat? Hmm. Quote, we would all agree that the traveler is and should be free not to buy. He can pass a motel because he doesn't like the town. He doesn't like the color. He doesn't like this name. He can stop and go in, and when he sees the owner, he can decide he doesn't like him because he doesn't like his mustache or his accent or his prices or his race or his other customers. Remember, this is a quotation from C. Ferris Bryant, Florida governor. Continuing his quote, he can turn around. He can walk out for any reason or no reason at all. Why? Why not? He's a free man. So is the owner of the property. And if the traveler is free not to buy because he doesn't like the owner's mustache, accent, prices, race, other customers, or for any or no reason, the owner of the property ought to have the same freedom. That's simple justice. The wonder is that it can be questioned, unquote. That was all C. Ferris Bryant, Florida's segregationist governor. Republican or Democrat? But he has this point. He's describing the freedom of association. And he's saying it's a matter of justice. Is he wrong about that? Um, if you take away freedom of association, you're taking it away from everybody, right? You're taking it away from the newly freed black who becomes a business owner as well. And really, it's about discretion. Do individual citizens in their personal capacity in their businesses have such a thing as discretion? Discretion by its very nature is not micromanaged by law. It's not micromanaged by a bureaucrat telling you how to do every little thing you're doing. Page 18 at the bottom, and this is the last paragraph that we're going to cover today. It tended to be segregationists who philosophized in this vein. Progressive politicians were seldom comfortable conveying to white voters that in exchange for civil rights, they were going to have to surrender certain basic freedoms they had until then taken for granted. Progressive politicians were seldom comfortable conveying to white voters that in exchange for civil rights, they were going to have to surrender certain basic freedoms they had until then taken for granted. Naturally, it was a delicate moment because the white public was sending mixed signals about whether it wanted to get rid of segregation in the first place. Okay, I told you this is going to be tough. It's tough stuff, but you have to cover it in American politics. And I think Christopher Caldwell does a wonderful job in The Age of Entitlement, America since the 60s. Christopher Caldwell, Simon and Schuster. Throw some money Simon and Schuster's way. Reward them for publishing such great material as this. We want to thank Simon and Schuster for making this material available. Check out their catalog and buy it. We'd like to thank Christopher Caldwell for writing it, for using his talents and labor to help us all understand this material. And um, thank you for joining me on the Republican Professor podcast. I've been your host, Dr. Lucas J. Mather. We'll see you next time. Tomorrow, I'm having a guest on as a return guest on the Republican Professor podcast. He's going to describe to me what it was like being at the Charlie Kirk Memorial. He was there. We'll see you next time.